So I've been involved in neurologic rehabilitation for a long time. I started out developing the first stroke unit at UCLA, and I needed some place to take my acute stroke patients to follow them up for rehab, because many of them were in various trials. And I got kind of interested then in rehab and recovery, and eventually I was far more interested in the recovery than I was in the acute stroke interventions, which have been horrendously disappointing up until TPA and then more recently some of the more invasive strategies for pulling clot out of the blood vessels. But for most people who have a serious stroke, the real problem is, how do I recover my speech? How do I recover use of my hand? How do I recover walking? My main interest has been in recovery of walking and upper extremity function over the years. And in that line, we've developed interventions and have run multi-center clinical trials to test some of these ideas out, and participated in studies that others have developed, putting patients in trials of drugs, of physical interventions, of cognitive interventions. And it's encouraging and somewhat discouraging in that over these years, 30 years, we really understand much, much more about the neuroscience of recovery, the neuroscience of brain injury, the science of how could the brain reorganize in order to help you do things that the stroke interferes with. So the most simple way to think about this is not that there are holes in the brain or something like that from a stroke, or blood in the brain, but rather that there are disconnections. So throughout the brain, information is constantly coming in from your sensory organs, your eyes, your ears, your joints, your muscles. And that information is in a sense kind of stupid. It doesn't, your eyes, when you see something, they don't really know what you're looking at. They don't actually see. The seeing part comes from information traveling back into the brain through a variety of connections back into the occipital cortex, where images begin to form as edges and shades of color and what have you. But then that information, having gone all the way from the eyes to the back of the brain, has to come forward again. And it has to get to regions that recognize that something that has 4 legs and is furry and little ears and a tail is probably a cat. Or that the person you're looking at is probably your spouse. And you know what it's like. You can look in a crowd of people, hundreds of people, and pick out a person that you know. That takes an incredible amount of cognition, an incredible amount of connectivity in the brain, both for old memories and new memories, for judgments, for context. You know what it's like when you're someplace and you see someone and you say, gee, I didn't know that guy was here. And then you realize, well, it isn't that guy. But, he's got a beard and the shape of the head and, that's similar to someone you know. So I got very interested in the cognitive motor aspect of movement. We don't just move to make a movement. We move to reach some goal. So the goal may be originally was probably to get away from some predator. I mean, the simplest cell, the original cells, at the time of evolution, basically would float around, and if something got in their way, they didn't go towards it, they got out of the way, because chances are it was going to eat them, okay? Well, we've developed a few added things to that. We can do a little more than just bounce away. And in fact, when we move to, you can just imagine over the time of evolution that mankind or developing man from non-human primates on out, basically had to figure out how to move and think if they were going to catch food or they were going to avoid an enemy. And so the connections between thinking and perception and planning and imagining, anticipating with movement had to be highly linked. And that's what's happened to us over time. We represent the epitome of this cognitive movement species. We can do more than any other animal can do. That also means that we're vulnerable, because if you disconnect a pathway, you may lose some of that ability. It also means that we're highly connected. And so maybe there's a way to drive ultimately the motor pools, the movement nerve cells in the spinal cord that ultimately allow us to contract a muscle or move a joint. And so maybe there's a visual way to do something, as opposed to the sort of automatic way that we never think about. An example would be, if I just hold this cup up and you have a hemiparesis and you have trouble reaching for the cup, normally in the brain, there are pathways that see that cup, immediately assess it for everything. Its weight, is it hot or cold? Am I going to burn myself? What's the shape of it? Where is it in relationship to my body? Can my hand reach it? What do I have to do to get my hand there? And as I go to reach for it, I pre-shape my hand. There are a whole set of nerve cells that do nothing more than look at an object, assess it, and make the hand the shape of that object. You don't go to an object like this. I'm not going to try to lift this with my fingers like that and then, have them eventually squeeze around the cup. I'm going to pre-shape my hand and reach for it. So one simple way of getting around a hemiparesis is, instead of thinking automatically that my hand's going to pre-shape to the shape of that as I reach, I say to myself, okay, I can see what that looks like. I want my hand to open up to that shape before I do anything. And so I'll try to open my hand a little bit, and then I'll reach. And it'll turn out that the reaching is far more successful. So I've just now used these visual motor pathways that have knowledge about a cup to figure out how to make a movement. So we've tried to push that, up that ante. So that means, is there a way to drive these pathways better? Is there a way to train the nervous system in a sense like learning? How do you learn a skill? And when we learn skills, it's again a very cognitive sort of thing. I mean, you think about the skill and you figure out, how am I going to move? I mean, maybe it's hitting a tennis ball. For the first time, you're holding a racket. Somebody says you will bring the racket back and hit the ball. So you bring the racket back and you swing at a ball coming at you and the ball goes, that way. But eventually, somebody says, well, move into the ball. And don't forget to keep your eye on the ball. You need to know where the ball is. And it's good to have your racket see the ball when you swing. And if you want the ball to go up a little bit, you better lift your racket a little bit. And pretty soon, and then your feet have to be in a certain place. And well, those are all skills that you're initially sort of taught. There's nothing natural about them. I mean, unless you're an incredibly, gifted athlete, you won't automatically do those things. But with a little bit of cueing or coaching, which is what a physical therapist or occupational therapist might do, you figure out ways in which you can take what you do have working and allow it to assist you making the movement that you're interested in. There are limits to this, though. How much movement do you actually have? Most people have a little more movement than they realize. And the goal of rehab is to try to bring out some of that movement. Sometimes that extra movement allows you to actually accomplish a task. Sometimes you gain more movement, but it's not really functional. So you're not really able to do something all that much better than you could do before. You can't dress any better, you can't eat any better with that affected hand. The ultimate goal is to get everybody able to use that affected arm, or get everybody able to walk reasonably well. One of the ideas is to practice doing things that are similar to what it is you want to accomplish. So for example, we started doing what's called body weight supported treadmill training, where put people in a harness connected to a hydraulic lift so it would move a little bit, and had people attempt to walk on a treadmill with the assistance of a therapist. The therapist would be behind the patient, try to help swing from the hip as they moved. The therapist might help lift the affected leg to swing forward. But the idea was to time the step. And we learned that if you step and kind of push into the ground, we know that there are reflex mechanisms in the spinal cord that will allow you to automatically flex the other hip for swing. So it's a little bit like a soccer kicker or a football kicker. When you go to kick a ball, you plant your leg, you plant it hard, and you swing and with the other leg. And so that load and swing is something we tried to build into the treadmill training. So we did a large study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, in which we compared practice at home with a therapist coming to the house versus coming to the laboratory and doing body weight supported treadmill training. The people at home did not get a lot of practice walking per se, but they did practice in their own home. The people who came to the lab practiced on the treadmill and over ground, trying to get better swing and loading the leg and having more confidence in loading their leg. And it turned out that after 3 months of therapy for each group, the results were the same. The body weight supported treadmill training wasn't better than the more conventional therapy done at home. But it wasn't really conventional therapy that was done at home. People were practicing in their own home. And I built that into the study because, to me, the context of where you practice could be important. You know, the home field advantage in sports. You know your basketball floor. You know where all the clunkers are. In the hockey rink, you know the angles. You have different depth perception in your own stadium. Well, one notion we had was that practicing in your home, on your own couch, on your own stairs, on your own carpets, might actually make you more likely to walk more and to get up and down more, because you were practicing in what you knew, as opposed to practicing in a clinic, which had things that you didn't know about and were, in a sense, not really relevant to you. And so everybody in the study improved a lot, but not one group didn't improve more than the other. And we think the reason is that the treadmill group, they practiced on the treadmill, which helped them get better, but then they didn't practice much at home. So what's the point of getting an interesting experimental treatment if you're not going to carry through and continue to practice at home? And you're just going to practice in the clinic in a setting that is, has a perfectly smooth floor and, is different than anything you would see in the real world. And the other group, because they had practiced at home, actually did more activity at home. And so even though they weren't specifically asked to practice walking, and they were mostly doing exercises and balance exercises and getting up and off the chair and that sort of thing, they did it a lot. And so they got just as strong and familiar with how to practice in that environment. So with that lesson in mind, I became interested in how can we get people to practice at home? Now, for 25 years, I've had people sitting next to me who had a stroke in the clinic, and I've said, okay, how much walking did you do in the last month? What do you do each day? And everyone always, the patient always says, oh, you know, I did a lot of walking. My favorite line was, I walk to the corner every day, okay? And I thought, well, that sounds good. And then this wife turns to me and says, but doctor, we live on the corner. It's only 30 feet away. So walking 30 feet a day is not going to get you better. If you want to walk better, you're probably going to have to practice walking where you want to walk, not in a clinic, but in the environment that you live in. And you're going to need to do it in increments of, if you can, a few minutes at a time, but a half dozen times a day. You know, you need to build up so you're practicing, you're walking for at least 40 to 60 minutes a day. While you're doing that, you're building up balance, you're building up stamina, you're helping to prevent another stroke or heart attack because you're getting more cardiovascular fitness. And the same with the upper extremity. You know, people say, oh yeah, I use my arm all the time. And then you watch them and they're hardly ever using it. But they think they're using it. No one's lying to me. I mean, this isn't like, you know, Donald Trump trying to explain something. This is, they really believe that they are doing what they can do. But the problem is they just can't really do it as much as they think they're doing it because it's hard and it's slow, it takes time, and you can do everything better with the other hand anyway. That isn't the one that isn't affected. So you thought about, well, here we have a series of problems. One is we'd like people to practice more, and we'd like them to buy into the idea that the practice is important and that it can help them get better. How can we do that? How can we get them practicing better and more? Another is that we know that practice is a fundamental part of learning. And if you're going to get those cognitive and motor pathways functioning, you know, get all those connections, some of which have been interrupted or degraded. If you're going to get them working better, you need to bring in as many of these pathways as you can, focused on the task of movement with the arm or walking. And then another side of this is that we know something about the pathways for learning in the nervous system. It's a very hot topic in the last 5-6 years. And we've come up with some medications that can enhance learning during practice. But if we want to test those drugs, we have to somehow have people practicing what's good. Otherwise, the drugs will enhance their learning of something that isn't good, that's wrong. Okay? Well, that would be a disaster. You'd be defeating yourself. So I started talking with our engineers, and we came up with a way to use sensors. One or two of you here have worn them. And the sensors are kind of like what you see, you know, with your watch, your Apple Watch, or the sensors in your phone or whatever, mostly accelerometers. But we learned that people with stroke walk very slowly and irregularly, and most of the commercial devices are very inaccurate in defining the steps or the walking speed or how much time it takes you to swing your leg or how much time you stand on each leg. So we developed bilateral ankle sensors that, with these very clever mathematical algorithms that interpret the movements. And so we were able to tell exactly what people were doing throughout the day. And we developed one for the upper extremity so we could tell how much they were using their affected arm. So now we have a fly on the wall. I know what you're actually doing. And I know how far you walked. I know how many times you walked. I know how fast you walked. I know what your heart rate was when you walked, how effortful it was. So now I can monitor you in the real world and capture that data. And for you, it's nothing. The data just gets dropped into your smartphone, and the smartphone sends the data to us at UCLA. So now I can tell whether you're practicing. And I need to know that. I also need to know about the quality of your practice. So if you're using your right upper extremity and you think that practice is this, just stretching your arm, or practice is just doing this, I want you to practice, trying to reach for that cup somehow. I want you to practice trying to grasp a little bit, or at least to reach into space in your workspace. Now, how am I going to know if you're doing that? Well, we developed another gadget. And that when you can sit there at home, it has this little $80 gizmo called a leap sensor in it. And we can actually see your movements over a kind of cigar box that has a acrylic clear glass, a clear plastic lid. And we can see what you're doing. We can count the movements, and we can look at the quality of those movements at home. So now I can tell whether you're practicing. I can tell something about the quality of your practice. You can do it at home in the context of real-world activities. You don't have to drag yourself into a clinic setting, especially in West Los Angeles at rush hour. And so we're now ready to do what we call tele-rehab, do rehab remotely, and see if we can get at least as good a result having you practice at home, where you're monitored and where a therapist can get on the phone with you once a week and say, I see you're improving in such and such, but it'd be good now to try doing X. Or, well, you've been able to do 10 repetitions of this. Let's see if we can go up to 15 or 20 and make it a little harder. Move the object a little further away. Or let's see what happens if we provide a little support to your shoulder to see if we can help you reach better. There are hundreds of things that the therapist could provide. And then the therapist knows whether or not you're cheating. And the doctor knows whether or not you're actually practicing what we want to see if you can get better. And this has been the bane of my existence. I just never know whether people are practicing enough. And I never know whether they're practicing well. How many of you, before you had a stroke, had some exercise equipment at home? Like a bicycle or a treadmill or... Okay. And did you use it? Good. Because at a meeting called Brain Attack, where we have nurses and physicians and a lot of people that come once a year to the UCLA stroke and rehab meeting, every year I'll say, well, how many of you have a treadmill at home? How many of you have a stationary bicycle at home? How many have a Stairmaster at home? And by the time I'm finished, these are healthy people. 3/4 of them have said yes. And then I say, and how many of you used it in the last 2 weeks? Even once? About 10% will raise their hand. So even healthy people hang their laundry on their bicycles and stuff and don't necessarily use them. It's a lot of trouble. Takes a lot of confidence, a lot of self-motivation. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that we have to develop self-management techniques. People have to understand why they need to practice and what they need to practice. What's the gain? They have to set goals that are reasonable. They have to have someone who understands this, like a therapist, assist them in looking for barriers that interfere with reaching those goals. And you have to provide really strong motivation. This is the kind of psychosocial support sometimes people need. Reem talks about these things all the time. They've never been part of a clinical trial. I mean, we tell people, this trial is about doing walking as much as you can, or practicing walking on a treadmill, or practicing walking while you're getting electrical stimulation, or while you're taking a medication. But no one really ever tells them how much to do, how often to do it. You kind of leave it up to them, and whatever they do, they do. Well, why should an intervention work if, like I said before, you don't practice in between the time you're doing the therapy? If you're going to a clinic for the therapy, it won't. It's just like you take those tennis lessons. You take a tennis lesson as a beginner once a week, and you only take that tennis lesson. You don't play during the week. How could you possibly get better? You're doomed to taking tennis lessons for the rest of your life and not getting a whole lot better because you're never really practicing. And that's the idea behind what we sometimes call pulse therapy, the idea of intermittently trying to practice things that you'd like to accomplish. But in this case, we're thinking about, well, how can we get more people better over a longer period of time? And the next step to this was, you've got people that may be able to practice at home. They can be monitored. We can tell them whether they're improving or not and how to try to improve a little bit more by giving them some feedback. We can build into them engaging into the process so that they understand what they're doing. It's not just a therapist saying, do these repetitive exercises, but they sort of understand how they're incorporating parts of the nervous system into these from other pathways to assist them, aid the so-called neuroplasticity of the nervous system. And then on top of that, we have some drugs that we think might enhance the rate of learning in people with a brain injury. So this is a complicated story, but it turns out, this is an aside for pet lovers, it turns out that genetically modified mice, some of them are really smart and some aren't so smart, okay? And so one of the faculty here, Alcina Silva, decided to find out what's different about the smarter mice. They're genetically very similar. And he found about a dozen different genes that accounted for why some mice are smarter than other mice. And most of those genes had something to do with the pathways that we understand that go into learning and memory. There's a whole series of chemical transformations that take place across the synapse, the connections between nerve cells. And these take place in different parts of the brain. And so we looked around to see if there was a drug that was available to us that was like one of the drugs that the smart mice had available to them. And it turned out that on nerve cells in the brain, there's a receptor. It's a dock. And substances land on that dock and affect the nerve cells inside, okay? It turned out that the AIDS virus gets into the brain using a dock that turns out to be essential for learning and memory. And no one knew this. I mean, people have wondered, why does the brain have a special place for the HIV virus to get into the nervous system? I mean, it couldn't have evolved waiting for HIV to raise its ugly head. And it turns out that the AIDS virus mutated over thousands and thousands of generations and found a way to get into the brain by using this receptor. And we have a drug that can block that receptor. It turns out that around the world there are people that don't have that receptor, And the AIDS virus can't get into the brain, and they can't get AIDS. 10% of Ashkenazi Jews in Israel don't have this receptor. And when they have a stroke, the stroke is much milder than their Ashkenazi Jews that do have the receptor. So, with a series of mouse models of stroke and brain injury that my colleagues worked on, with all this information, we are taking the drug Maraviroc, which is available for people with AIDS, which sounds scary to people who want to participate, because it's not because they have AIDS that you would be taking it. It's actually underutilized. It's not used a lot. Other drugs have come to be much more used. But it turns out that when you use this drug, it allows nerve cells to retain information better. They don't get overused. Whatever they just learned, they retain much better. And so we're now combining this drug with practice that we can monitor in a telerehabilitation setting. And the patients only have to show up at the beginning and end of the study. And everything's done from their home. And we think this is a design for the future. It's cheap. You know, it doesn't cost a lot because you don't have to have a lot of personnel. You have to have a lot of travel. The devices that we use are remarkably inexpensive and only get cheaper. And we can then hopefully counter a problem that has been the bane of research in trying to get people better. And that is that we want people to practice. Whatever the intervention is, they've got to practice. Whether it's, you know, the goal is better walking, better use of the hand, better language. They've got to be focused on practice, and we don't know how to get to them from a distance. And now we can be in their living room or bedroom. The question is, will they comply? And we're learning that people have a lot of excuses for not doing things. But because we're talking to them, we know whether they're not practicing. We know that the next day, we know whether they haven't practiced the day before. We can call them up and say, so what's going on? Well, sometimes it turns out that, you know, you had a cold, or, you know, you had to go to a wedding or something. Sometimes it turns out, you know, I just didn't feel good. And so you can talk about it a little bit. And it wasn't that they didn't feel good, but, you know, they just got a little lazy. They needed a little incentive. And so we'll say, well, you don't have to do the whole thing. Why don't we just try a little bit, see how it goes? And you know what it's like. Once you get started, sometimes, you know, you rev up and you keep going. So we're hoping to take a variety of devices that are out there on the market. Some are being developed that can be used at home. And it doesn't matter quite what the device is. What matters is that it allows for you to progressively practice. You know, keep upping the ante, reaching a little farther, grasping with a little stronger, or a little more accurately, a little bit, you know, more direct line. Walking a little better, you know, using each leg more rhythmically, getting your trunk balance better, speaking a little more.